The name Exmoor conjures mental images of ponies, undulating moorland and Lorna Doone, or D Blackmore's 1869 novel. Exmoor crosses the Somerset and Devon border, hugging the North Devon coast, and takes its name from the River Exe. Like Kielder in Northumberland, Exmoor is an international dark sky reserve, making it a perfect place to observe the wonders of the night sky. This wild and beautiful place, designated a national park in 1954, is home to a whole range of folklore. Witches, ghosts, pixies, superstitions, and the famous Beast of Exmoor, the park features them all. So let's investigate some of these tales further in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with the folklore of moors, and I thought it was quite a good idea because we've already done Dartmoor to actually look to somewhere that's in a similar part of the country, but also has a lot of folklore attached to it, and that's Exmoor. Before I go any further though, I do want to say that this week's episode is brought to you Sesame Street style by foxgloves, which in the Victorian language of flowers meant insincerity. And if you're wondering where I get these definitions from, there's an absolutely fabulous illustrated language of flowers dictionary from 1865 by Mrs. Burke on archive.org, and I tend to get them all from there. But like I say, we are continuing with moors, and like I say, Exmoor at first seemed like a bit of an obvious choice, and then I looked into it and it seemed it was a bit more difficult, and then I actually found a couple of books dedicated to Exmoor folklore, which made life a lot easier. So we are going to have a look at lots of little small bits of folklore, sort of to give you more of an overview before we get on to the Beast of Exmoor, because you can't not look at that, rather than there being like one specific story that we follow all the way through to the end. And we are going to start off with witches, because most places in Europe have some tales of witches to some degree or another, and Exmoor is obviously no exception. But one of the interesting things here is witches don't always fall foul of those who might persecute them. So in one particular tale, there was a place called the Poult Inn, which stood at Heathpool Cross, and Fanny Pope lived there with her grandson. Now, apparently her grandson always managed to find a good hare for the hunters to chase, although one day the hunters heard him shout, "Run, Granny, run, or they will catch you," which might seem like a bit of an interesting choice of words. Later, the hunters arrived at the inn and spotted Fanny looking rather bedraggled and out of breath, so the hunters wondered if she was the hare. Now, the story goes no further, but we can only assume the hunters never actually managed to catch her to confirm their suspicions. There are, of course, multiple reasons why somebody might be bedraggled and out of breath, so it does seem like a bit of a reach, but I suppose because there is this quite famous link between witches and hares and the belief that witches could turn into hares, you could see why, based on what the grandson allegedly said, they made that link themselves. I mean, the grandson could also have just basically been taking the mick out of them and decided to shout that just to kind of wind them up, but we'll never know if that's true. But in a similar sort of tale, where there was a holly tree near Orr Manor, which became linked with witchcraft when locals associated the tree with a witch called Molly. Now, nobody would venture past the tree and the nearby gate after dark in case they encountered Molly. Now, this seems a bit odd because apparently she was only 6 inches tall and would stand on the gate. But I suppose at the same time that would probably freak you out anyway, so I can see why people might want to avoid the area. And on other occasions, Molly took the form of a white hare that stood in the lane. So again, we have that link between hares and witches. I do have a whole episode on hares that's on Patreon if you are a Patreon supporter, so please do feel free to check that out if you are part of the Fabulous Folklore family. But surprisingly, witches could also be readily found on Exmoor even in the 1850s, and it is obviously more likely that the tales of witches are far older than that, but I did think it was quite cool in a lot of ways that the book that I was looking at from 1903 was referring to them almost still being within living memory, which is quite cool. And in one particular story, a farmer believed the decline of his cattle to be due to a witch's influence, and he set off for the nearest white witch, who in the book is also sometimes referred to as a conjurer. And this white witch lived 30 miles away, so it just shows how important it was to this farmer to get to the bottom of it that he was willing to travel so far. Now, the White Witch then listened to the farmer and concluded that yes, witchcraft was to blame, and in fact, the witch responsible lived in a shack near the farmer's homestead. So the farmer left the home of the White Witch and stormed off to the shack, accompanied by a group of his neighbours. And that is just wrong on so many levels when you consider the fact that this is an elderly woman, clearly living in poverty, about to be set upon, as it were, by this group of local people. There's so many power dynamics going on here. But when they got there, they actually found the old woman feverish on her deathbed. And they considered this to be the work of the White Witch. And you sort of go, interesting, White Witch causing harm against a witch. That sounds like witchcraft, but never mind. And unfortunately, when the old woman finally died, they actually burnt the shack down and then demolished the walls. So there isn't anything as to whether the farmer's fortunes improved or not. I kind of, in a weird sort of way, hope that they didn't, because it would then exonerate the old woman, but there we go. But this is indeed how people still, in some cases, would treat sudden or unexpected changes in fortune. Now, the author of this 1903 book, Frederick Snell, actually gave the advice that it was best to defer to witches where possible and to help them in any way that you could, thus ensuring that you didn't end up on the wrong end of their powers. And he does note the danger in both receiving from and refusing gifts to witches. So obviously, if they offered you something, you should take it, but if they asked for something, you should give them it. And he relates a tale in which an old woman stopped at a farm to ask for a drink of cider. Now, the family had none to spare following a dismal apple harvest, and the old woman hobbled away muttering curses under her breath. Soon after, the farmer was hit by financial misfortune, and then each of his daughters, apparently, and he puts it, pined and died, so obviously didn't have a good time at all. Now, is it likely that the old woman cursed the farmer? Probably not. I mean, obviously, her muttering to herself and saying like, "Oh, you'll regret the day you did that," doesn't help the situation. But if they've already had a dismal apple harvest, then suffering further misfortune, you kind of go, "Are those two things connected?" Probably. But of course, coincidence was often used to justify a sudden change in luck, as if being persecuted for refusing a request is somehow preferable than being the victim of bad luck. And I sort of feel like, wouldn't you rather think, "Oh, it's just chance," or "It's just fortune's wheel has turned again"? To me sounds like a better way of dealing with things going a bit wrong than going, somebody must be persecuting me. But that's just me. Now, Snell also explains that so many farms and houses on Exmoor actually had ovals moulded into the ceiling because anything beneath those figures was then considered sacred. And that does actually certainly make a change from the usual apotropaic marks used to ward off witches, such as the daisy wheel or the VV and so on. And obviously I've got an entire episode on them if you're interested in such apotropaic marks. We can't talk about witches without talking about the devil. Though, to be fair, these following stories don't actually involve witches at all, but they just make a nice segue. Because there's one strand of folklore that's particularly rich, particularly in the British Isles actually, but also elsewhere, and that's the devil in the landscape. And I really love these stories because basically the devil does something that then results in a change to the landscape. And I just think that it's quite funny because he's often throwing rocks in a fit of temper or something that then become these notable rock formations. And it kind of makes him sound a little bit like a really overly dramatic prima donna. And I just find the idea of it, the mental image, is quite funny. But anyway, back to Exmoor. According to legend, the devil decided he was going to build a bridge over the River Barle, and he also did so in a single night because he's the devil, so he can do these things. And this actually resulted in the tar steps that you can still visit today. Now, the devil being the devil, he then refused to let anyone safely cross the bridge. And worse, he would destroy the first creature that crossed it. So a parson sent a cat across the bridge, which the devil then dutifully tore to pieces. But it does seem that the devil's spell only lasted for that one creature, and the cat's death then broke his curse, and people could safely use the bridge. Now, that sort of story does appear in quite a lot of places, and there's a similar one relating to the Rialto Bridge in Venice as well. So it's quite a common story type that then just gets associated with different types of bridges. Now, the construction of the steps also explained the existence of Dunkery Beacon, which was the summit of Dunkery Hill, the site of several Bronze Age burial mounds. Now, the beacon marks the highest point on Exmoor at 520 metres above sea level. And in the story, the devil was carrying rocks in his apron to build the last section of the steps when the strap broke. The rocks fell to the ground and became Mounsey Castle. Tired from building the tar steps, the devil then took a break on Winsford Hill, and finding himself thirsty, he tore a chunk of the hill away to reach the water beneath. He threw the rock over his shoulder, and then that became the Dunkery Beacon, while the hole on Winsford Hill is the Punch Bowl. Now, if that wasn't enough, the devil is also allegedly responsible for the wit stones, where he and a giant had a throwing competition which resulted in the stone's location, but nobody actually knows who won the contest. So there's quite a lot of throwing rocks around basically involved in this one. And I do think it's quite interesting that you then think, how big would the devil have to be that a rock that he was carrying in his apron could then become like what we would consider quite a large hill? It does make you think. But we are going to jump from one supernatural creature to lots of supernatural creatures. So we're going to go from the devil to ghosts. And according to the paranormal database, there are a few ghosts on Exmoor. And for example, in the Chetsford water area, people hear thudding hooves or neighing horses, even though there are no horses nearby. Lightning shattered a large standing stone in 1996. Paranormal database didn't really say where that was. They said it was near Menhir, but the standing stone type is a Menhir, so I did have to do a little bit more looking. And it does look like it's actually the one near Mattock's Down Barrow, but if anybody actually knows otherwise, please do feel free to let me know. But according to the legend, the ghosts of any soldiers killed on the ancient battlefield nearby actually gather at this stone that was struck by lightning. Meanwhile, in the Doone Valley, there was actually a 19th century sighting of a werewolf, and remember that because it's actually going to come in handy later on. You see, I'm even giving you homework. But a woman described seeing a grey man stalking a large rabbit after dark. Now, that might be a little bit strange as it was, but the man having the head of a wolf made it even weirder. A stag ran out from a nearby thicket and the werewolf vanished. Now, obviously, you do have to wonder if it was a man with a dog's head, would that not make him one of the cynocephali or dog-headed men, or would it make him a werewolf? Again, a little bit unusual in a lot of ways, but I'd again remember the werewolf bit. But in terms of ghosts in a more classical sense, clergymen on Exmoor were noted for their ability to lay ghosts, which is basically the fancy way of saying getting rid of them. It's not quite the same as an exorcism as far as I can tell, but it's definitely a way of just ensuring that the ghost isn't bothering anyone. So whenever a ghost troubled locals, their pastor was often the first port of call. Except Snell actually notes an occasion in which the parson himself was the problem. So this nameless parson died, so he's not given a name or a location or anything. It's just a story that was related by a local farmer. But the mourners buried this parson following all of the usual rituals, so all should have been well. Yet when they returned to his house following the burial, they found his ghost sitting in his armchair. He returned every night, and no amount of praying or even reasoning with him did any good. There's no sense that he actually did anything to annoy anyone. I think it was just the fact that he was there when he shouldn't have been was enough to sort of start getting up people's noses. But eventually they called in another parson whose reputation for ghost laying preceded him. When this parson arrived, the ghost got up out of his armchair and actually followed the ghostbuster out of the house. The locals watched the pair cross the meadows opposite, and when they reached an apparently bottomless pool, there was a flash of lightning and the ghost disappeared, never to be seen again. So I have no doubt that this particular episode must have added to the ghost-busting parson's reputation, but it's also quite interesting that the ghost would disappear near a pool, because part of the folklore often sees whoever the ghost layer is, usually there's a group of them and they kind of say enough prayers at the ghost and then capture them in something, usually a bottle, and then it's dropped into some kind of body of water. Occasionally they're even taken all the way to the Red Sea, or so the story will tell you. So in this case it sounds like the ghostbuster has somehow managed to conjure the ghost into a bottle or some description and then thus toss it into the pool. How they knew it was bottomless, I'm not really sure because that's never mentioned, but there we go. And as I say, that particular ghost-laying parson is quite a common part of folklore in different parts of the country. And something else that's very common in other parts of the country is fairies. And you would expect somewhere like Exmoor to be absolutely knee-deep in stories of fairies. But the thing that really stands out is actually the difference drawn between pixies and fairies. So they're seen as being two different things. Frederick John Snell references Mrs. Bray's Traditions of Devonshire, in which Mrs. Bray explains this difference, because, as she says, pixies are actually, and I quote, the souls of infants who are so unhappy as to die before receiving the Christian rite of baptism, end quote. Now, apparently, pixies prefer solitary places, hills, woods or streams, but pixies also love dancing, especially in circles or rings. Now, surprisingly, they don't actually always dance to music, which is something that we see quite a lot with fairy. So if you remember the fairy episode where we talked about fairy hills and so on, there's usually fairy music that humans can hear, and that's what draws humans into the dancing, except pixies seem to just kind of dance to anything with a good rhythm, which sort of makes me think of Tyres from Spaced, if anyone remembers that on Channel 4. But they apparently would find melody and rhythm in all sorts of sounds from nature. So think of things like crickets, or frogs making the various noises, or even birds shrieking and screeching and so on. The pixies would dance to any and all of these things if it had a good enough beat, apparently. And pixies also possess shape-shifting powers, although they always wore green. Now, this last one is particularly noteworthy because in many places fairies are associated with the colour green, except, according to Catherine Briggs, the fairies of Exmoor were apparently partridge-sized and reddish-brown all over, including their complexion, and if anyone did see them, it was in the blink of an eye. So there does seem to be a difference drawn between the pixies and the fairies. Now, it's not all fun and games, as pixies also stole young children, led travellers astray, and also like to play practical jokes, which kind of puts them in the same wheelhouse as a lot of traditional fairies as well. Some villagers spoke of having helpful pixies who would aid them in their chores, especially if they were elderly, but as with brownies, if you presented what you thought was a gift of clothes, then the pixie would usually end up taking the gift and leave, and you'd never see them again. And usually what seems to happen in the stories is it's not like the Coal Ladder Hilton, where somebody gives them the clothing to get rid of an annoying pixie. It's almost that people think they're doing something nice by giving the pixie clothes, and then the pixie leaves, and it's kind of, oops, shouldn't have done that. So it's more of an accidental casting out, as it were, of the pixie. Now, pixies apparently didn't go near churches and preferred to congregate in those wild, desolate spaces largely avoided by humans, which is an interesting point because Snell does suggest that smugglers may have encouraged stories of pixies on Exmoor to conceal their own activities. And again, such stories do appear all over the country, but especially along the coast, where smugglers would use tales of fairies to deter people from getting too close to their hiding spots in caves. Now, one of the things that you might have noticed so far is I've been saying, yeah, this story also appears elsewhere. And one thing I noticed while I was looking up a lot of the Exmoor folklore is that quite a lot of locations also featured a lot of the same practices. So it wasn't like folklore that was very specific to the area. However, there were other practices that became region specific. So that's why I've kind of tried to, in this section where we're going to have a look at superstitions, omens and divination, I've tried to leave out the ones that I've found elsewhere and just focus on the ones that are a bit more region specific. So for example, one Exmoor superstition involved dreaming, and specifically men should avoid sleeping on Exmoor because if they did and dreamt of eggs, copper money or a clergyman, it meant that misfortune was on the way. Quite what would happen if you dreamt of all three, I can only imagine. But if a girl dreamed of a viper, it meant that she had a secret enemy working to harm her. It was also considered extremely bad luck to see your double on Exmoor, and there was a tale of a man from Dulverton who was riding towards the station who died after his horse threw him. Now, a neighbour actually expressed her total lack of surprise upon hearing the news, adding that the man had seen himself a week earlier. So if you did see yourself, obviously this was a bad omen, but what you had to do was then allow a considerable period of time to go by before you then used that same route again where you had actually seen your double. And if you let enough time go by, it almost kind of cancelled it out in some way. This man apparently hadn't done that. And in one village, locals also noticed that whenever the parson finished his sermon at 4 p.m, something awful would happen to a villager within the week. Now, that could be anything from sort of financial misfortune or death or an accident. It wasn't the same thing every time, but it was always whenever the parson finished at 4 p.m. So eventually they just kind of took him to one side and had a bit of a word with him. And then the parson actually went along with it and made sure that his sermon either went past 4 p.m. or stopped well short of it. And finally, it wouldn't be an episode of Fabulous Folklore without a love divination, wouldn't it? We haven't had any for a while, but they are bubbling away there, I promise. But this one falls into that notable class of finding out the initials of your intended. And in this particular instance, it has some similarities to other ones, but was specific enough that I thought I'd include it. So a single woman would put a basin of water under her bed on Midsummer's Eve, and she would float the letters of the alphabet face down on the water. The following morning, she would then check the water, and if 2 or 3 of the letters had turned over, they would provide the initials of her future husband. Obviously, I'm pretty sure that you too can see the flaw in that one, because obviously what do you do if somebody has like the same initials? So their first name and surname have the same letter. Would that just turn over once and then that would be the only one? Who knows? Naturally, I am tempted to try, because you know what I'm like with these love divinations. I love the idea of giving some of them a go. I did for Halloween and nothing happened, but that's a side issue. But a woman could also use another divination to find out when she would marry. So she would actually make a pendulum by tying somebody else's wedding ring to one of her hairs, and then on Midsummer's Day, bang on noon, she would hang the ring in a glass of water, and she needed to count how many times the ring struck the glass by the final stroke of 12 for noon, and the number of times it did that would tell her how many years she would have to wait before she'd marry. You know, that could be horrible if it didn't do it at all, but there we go. That is the risky business. That is the game of love divination. Now, because I'm aware that this episode has ended up a little bit longer than I was expecting, because once I started I found way more than I thought I would, I have probably left the most well-known legend to the end, and that is the Beast of Exmoor. Now, I have talked about alien big cats on the podcast before, particularly around the Beast of Bodmin, but Exmoor does have its own creature, and tales of the Beast of Exmoor date to 1983. 80 sheep were killed in a period of 90 days in North Devon, and as an example, farmer Eric Lay actually lost £2,000 worth of livestock in 2 months to the beast. Now, it actually first started in 1982, and he first blamed foxes, but when he then lost 30 lambs by April 1983, thoughts turned to much larger predators. Now, an early sighting described a large black and cat-like animal, which apparently had white feet and a long sweeping tail. A local bus driver placed the animal's height at about 2'6" to the shoulder after seeing it in a lane. Somebody else described an animal that was 4 to 5 feet long and had a colt-like face and eyes that didn't reflect lamplight. Now, obviously, cats' eyes famously reflect lamplight, so when people were talking about it being a cat-like animal, it did start to then raise questions with all these other descriptions. And despite regular patrols by farmers, the animal kept killing even in those areas under surveillance. There was quite a lot of talk at the time about it being dogs, and while dogs were being caught sheep worrying, a lot of the farmers knew what a dog attack looked like, whereas these weren't the frenzied attacks among a whole group of sheep that you would get with dogs. It was quite a precise, almost surgical killing of a sheep that was targeted, which is much more like a cat. In June 1983, 2 schoolboys claimed to have encountered the beast while they were on holiday on a farm, and they said it had a head like an Alsatian with green eyes, and they said it stood at 4 to 5 feet tall. I can't help thinking it would be 4 to 5 feet long rather than standing that tall, because otherwise, like, an animal that's, you know, that tall, that just seems a bit unlikely. But at the time, the Royal Marines actually got involved, and one of them reported seeing a large, powerfully built black cat-like animal. Now, that went against the whole dog narrative, and that particular person did end up changing their story, but they did eventually change it back. And the problem was the Daily Express, being the Daily Express, then offered a £1,000 reward for anyone who could shoot the beast, and after an outcry about having amateur hunters roaming Exmoor at the same time as the Royal Marines, the paper then changed the challenge to £1,000 for the first photograph. Now, the stunt still prompted the Royal Marines to withdraw before the hunt was finished, because obviously they didn't want to put any of their men at risk, and they also didn't want their men to then inadvertently injure anybody and then obviously get the blame for the other person being somewhere they shouldn't have been, quite honestly. Now, naturally, other theories were put forward about what the beast actually was. Somebody said it was a pig, another person blamed aliens, because of course they did, and yet another said that it was a local werewolf, and that was why I was saying bear werewolves in mind, because I thought that was quite interesting that somebody would have apparently seen a werewolf back in the 19th century, but then somebody else brought it up as a possible identity for the Beast of Exmoor. And then in 1985, park wardens reported seeing 2 black cat-like animals, sparking fears that the Beast of Exmoor had actually started a family. By 1988, a biologist decided to try a different tactic to capture the beast, and Nigel Briley intended to take a potion extracted from catmint with him onto the moor. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a follow-up article to see what happened, if anything. And then when more sheep were killed and eaten in October 1990, so we're at 7 years later now, the police called in a naturalist to determine if the beast was back. And again, I couldn't find a follow-up, but the story seemed to peter out, and either the media got bored or locals just got used to seeing the beast. There were apparently sightings as recently as 2010, or at least they were mentioned online that there were sightings, but I can't find any newspaper reports of them, so if there were any, it's likely that it wasn't actually mentioned in the media. We do obviously have to wonder, is the Beast of Exmoor still out there? Was it a cat after all? Because a lot of the descriptions do sort of sound almost a bit like something that may or may not have been a panther, but it's not like the Beast of Bodmin, which seems a little bit more clearly feline. The Beast of Exmoor kind of seems to take on lots of different shapes, so it obviously does make you wonder what it is. Is there more than one of whatever it is? And I think unless anyone captures a genuine photograph or the animal itself turns up dead somewhere, I don't think we'll ever know what it is. And that's one of the things that I have a bit of a problem with this idea of alien big cats anyway, because it's unlikely that the beast seen in 2010, if it was seen in 2010, is the same one as 1983. And bearing in mind, the closest candidate for the beast seems to be a big cat of some description. Panthers can live in the wild for up to 20 years. But this one would have to be almost 30, which makes it a little bit more difficult to believe. And I think while, yes, food's obviously plentiful, at the same time you sort of think at some point it would die. And I would imagine somebody would come across its carcass at some point. So it does make you wonder, is it still out there? What were people seeing? Because clearly something was going on. Or is it more likely that it was just another result of the Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976, where people then just released all these exotic animals that they kept as pets? Was it just simply the after effects of that? That's probably my guess, to be honest, but I guess we'll never really know. So what do we ultimately make of Exmoor and its folklore? Well, much of the folklore is quite similar to other places, such as the tales of the devil and his landscaping exploits. And we do have to wonder if these stories were commonplace and people simply added local variations, or if they somehow spontaneously emerged in different places and only gained the similarities when people started to write them down. But the stories still hold value because they do tie these tales, as generalised as they might be, to specific locations and thus root the lore in the land itself. Now, the stories of the pixies are a good example because while some of their behaviour dovetails with that of the brownie or even the will-o'-the-wisp at times, describing them as the souls of unbaptised infants makes them different from their fairy cousins, and the fact that Snell's book wholly discusses pixies and barely mentions fairies is worth noting. But I do think the one that obviously steals the show is the Beast of Exmoor itself. But again, even this idea of beasts isn't unique to Exmoor, and I think it fits the location really well, and I think it works kind of with that sort of wild landscape that we see in Exmoor. But I think the fact that we don't know what it is what helps to add to the mystique. And I think if we ever found out that it was just an escaped panther or a released panther, it kind of somehow wouldn't really have the same level of legendary status because we would know what it was. And I can't help thinking that's part of the issue with quite a lot of these kind of legends, that they lose their allure when you actually know what they are. But please do feel free to tell me which is your favourite Exmoor legend of the ones I've just related. If you know any other ones, obviously feel free to share them. It's always cool to collect them. And if you have theories on what the Beast of Exmoor is, or even better, if you think you've seen it, please do feel free to let me know, because that would be really cool as well. You can leave comments in all the usual places. The Spotify ones are irritating because I can't respond, but at least I will still see it. YouTube is best for comments, followed by the blog that this episode is actually attached to, and the link is in the show notes. Final thing I'll say before I go, because obviously I have gone on a bit longer than usual, is the fact that I am running a competition. I'm not mentioning it on social media purely because I want this to actually be for podcast listeners, and I don't want just some like random person who's come across it on Instagram to get involved. I'd rather be giving the competition prizes away to people who actually listen to the podcast. So what I've done is I've handmade a little crochet ghost. Actually, I say a little, he's probably about 4 or 5 inches tall because I use bigger yarn than usual. But I've crocheted a ghost because we know how much I love ghosts here on Fabulous Folklore. There's also a copy of my short story collection, Black Dog and Other Gothic Tales, and the stories are all inspired by folklore in some shape or form. There is a set of the 5 promotional kind of tarot cards that DK made to celebrate the release of Rebel Folklore, which I've only got 2 sets of them, so I'm giving one of them away. And then there's a very, very cool enamel pin badge as well, also made with the Rebel Folklore cover. So 1 lucky winner will win all of that. 10 runners up will win one of the enamel pin badges, and they are very cool. And all you have to do is basically go to the Google form, that the link is in the show notes as well, and just simply tell me which are your favourite kinds of episodes, like what kind of content do you like and things like that. If you have a favourite episode, which one is it? And also what platform do you listen on? Just because I'm nosy and I'd like to hear where people are coming in from when they come across the show, because that also kind of then helps me know, are people actually using Spotify? Some of you have been leaving comments, so I know that you have, but it's kind of, I'm just nosy more than anything else. So yeah, the link is in the show notes. So as I say, I think I'm going to close the entries in the end of the first week of February, because Fabulous Folklore turns 5 this month, so I'm going to kind of give you the whole month to enter into that, and then I'll use random number generators and what have you to pick a winner. So you will need to leave your name and email address, and then I'll get in touch with the winners in early February. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed Exmoor. I think next week we're going to be having a look at either Culloden Moor or Denby Moor. I haven't decided which yet, but if you do have a particular moor in mind, please do let me know. And I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.